One of my very favorite qualities about wax seals is how each and every one is unique. Kind of like a snowflake, you can never really find two that are exactly the same, even if you're using the same stamp over and over again. Now, there's a lot of different effects that you can get with the way that you pour the wax, the temperature of the wax, the way that you place the stamp on top of that hot wax. And one of my favorite techniques is to kind of get that more organic edge. I really like the unfinished edge. It kind of has this fine art, a little bit raw effect. But if you're going for a more modern, minimal vibe, there are few things more beautiful or fitting than that perfectly round wax seal. Arguably, it is the hardest effect, the hardest edge to get with a wax seal. The perfectly round wax seal takes a little bit more attention and care in its creation, but is not impossible to get. Today, I'm going to share with you my very favorite tips and tricks for getting that perfectly round wax seal in this step-by-step tutorial. For the sake of consistency, I will be talking about kind of using a 1-inch diameter wax seal. If you're using something that's a little bit larger, you'll want to add more wax and just kind of increase all of the measurements that I'm going to be sharing with you. And if you're using something smaller, obviously you'll want to decrease it. For everything, it will take a little bit of trial and error. Wax seals is just one of those things that you do need to test a couple times before you start diving in, putting them on your actual wedding invitations, etc. But most of the wax seals that you will see kind of on the market are going to be a 1-inch diameter. So that's kind of what I'm sticking with. That's what I use for all of my tutorials, and it's what we'll be using today. The first thing that you're going to want to do is avoiding bubbles on your wax seal. So bubbles, kind of like a blemish on a pretty face, bubbles on a wax seal, it just kind of ruins the overall effect. It ruins some of the symmetry. It can be kind of distracting and end up taking away from the overall beauty of the piece. While it can be overlooked when you're seeking that perfectly round wax seal look, a bubble can quickly give you that asymmetrical or kind of unintentional aesthetic. So to avoid bubbles in your wax, make sure you are keeping the melting temperature low. So a melting gun, if you're using a melting gun or a glue gun, which is kind of my favorite technique and what I'm going to be using throughout this tutorial, you'll want to set the temperature to low. Now, if you're using a glue gun that doesn't have a temperature setting, make sure that you are turning it off every once in a while so that the wax doesn't get too hot. When it gets too hot, it basically boils, and that results in kind of bubbles in your finished piece, which isn't really the vibe that we're going for. If you're using a melting spoon, you'll just want to make sure that your spoon is not touching the flame. That will kind of help it to get too hot. But if you see bubbles forming in the wax in the spoon, that's a good indication that it's getting too hot. When I remove my spoon from the candle, I often pause for a moment just to give it another moment to cool down. That little bit of pause, that little bit of extra time and attention to detail will help to save you a lot of wax in the long run because you won't have to remelt and refigure out things because of bubbles. The next tip will involve your pouring technique. The technique used is really the key to getting your desired shape. A sloppy pour will result in a sloppy edge with a more organic effect. And again, if this is what you are going for, that's great. But if you want that perfectly round edge where it's really even on every side of your stamp, then you want to kind of avoid that sloppy pour. It's kind of trendy right now with TikTok and YouTube videos to pour really high. It has kind of a fun effect. It feels really cool. But that will automatically give you kind of that more organic edge. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One, it's harder to control, and so you're more likely to have kind of that sloppy landing, if you will. Two, your wax will be cooling on the way down, especially because it is traveling so far. And then the wax will cool at different rates, meaning that not only will you have kind of some ripples in your wax, but it will also have kind of an uneven edge that'll be harder to get rid of when you place your stamp. Pour your wax low and close to your surface. Whether you're working on an envelope, you're using baking paper, or a silicone mat, the more perfect the circle of the wax blob, for lack of a better word, the more likely that your end result will be that perfect rounded shape. Now, if your wax blob, again for lack of a better term, is more of an oval shape or has some irregularities, fear not. This part can be forgiven. You just want it to be as close together as possible. When you press down your stamper, the wax will disperse and it will become more even than it appears. But the closer you can get to this part being round, the more likely it is that you will have success in achieving that modern, minimal, perfectly round wax seal. For a 1-inch wax seal, I find that kind of my perfect amount of wax is a full pump from a glue gun or your melting gun. So a full pump will give you a really nice edge without it being too much or too heavy and overwhelming for the stamp itself. If you're using a 3D stamp, like the ones that I'm showing you right now, those have a little bit more of their recess to take up, and so you'll want to add, I usually add about half a pump more. So I do a full pump and then I do kind of half a pump or a partial pump, and that will help to fill in that space without taking all of the wax that I will need to create that even lip around my stamper when I place it. So kind of play around with your individual stamp. If it's a new stamp to you, you might need to test it out a couple times before you find that perfect amount of wax, especially if it's kind of like my vintage peony where there is a lot of three-dimensional space, kind of concave, that will need to be filled with wax. Now, if you're using melting beads, that is a little bit more of kind of a testing, and you want to find kind of your perfect medium. I usually start with adding 3 beads to my spoon, and that's because you will need wax to push out enough wax from your spoon in order to create that perfect shape. There will always be wax left over in your spoon. That's fine, that's completely normal, but you will just need to keep in mind that there are beads that are going to be pushing wax out. So after that, I usually only add 1 or 2, but I kind of like to speed the process up, so I usually add 2 for every 1 wax seal that I am creating. And what I'm specifically talking about is the Artisire brand. That is the brand that I primarily use. It's the one that I have the most experience with. If you're buying something off of Amazon, those are going to be different sizes. And so I'm hesitant to give you any sort of formula. Just know that if they say, you know, like this, a bead is equal to 1 stamp, you'll need to put in at least 2 or 3, just again to have enough wax that is kind of pushing it off the edge so you are able to create a stamp. So it's going to be a little bit of trial and error. If the lip of your wax seal, it's either like too thick or it's looking uneven, you're really having trouble getting that even edge, try using a little bit less wax. So kind of pull back a little bit on the wax. However, if your lip in 1 or 2 areas is like not really existent, or it's not even making it to the lip, you definitely need to add more wax. All right, now it's time to make some magic happen. Your wax is the right temperature, so we're avoiding any future wax seal zits, if you will. And we have carefully placed that perfect temperature wax down onto our surface. It's time to place the stamper itself, and I want to assure you, please do not rush this part. Even though the wax, as soon as it comes out of the gun or off of the spoon, is starting to cool, it's not quite as fast as a process as we like to make it be in our head. You do have a moment to step back, take a deep breath, and then place your stamper. This is the key to getting that perfectly round wax seal. You want to have very even pressure as you're putting your stamper down. You want it to be, you don't want it to be like off, when it's off to the side, it's going to be pushing some wax off into a different direction, which will give you an uneven disbursement of wax. You want it to go very slowly, be very even, and placed at the very center of that wax blob that we poured down. So again, I have found this step, while you need to be careful, there is some forgiveness here. If you're placing your stamp down and you see, oh, I'm obviously too far off to one side, because you're moving slowly and nice and evenly, you'll be able to kind of correct a little bit so that the wax is more evenly distributed around every edge. Just move very slowly, and that will kind of ensure that you have a nice even placement and that the wax is dispersed evenly around your stamper. All right, once your stamper is down, the hard part is over. But maybe the hardest part is letting your wax sit until it is fully cooled. Now, if you have placed your stamper on ice in order to kind of get that brass nice and cold, this will be a faster process for you. And if you need more details on that or just tips on wax seals in general, I do have tons of videos that I will have linked down below or in the cards above. But in order to avoid fingerprints or just messing up our wax seal, you need to allow it to completely cool. And that takes about 5 to 10 seconds, especially if you, again, have cooled your stamper beforehand. And if you need some help with that, again, I'll have some videos linked down below. But if you haven't, I recommend waiting until at least 15 seconds. It would be better to wait a little bit longer than to pick it up too early. Now, how you can tell if your stamp is done is if you give your stamper a little bit of a wiggle and the wax kind of seems to pull with it, or it kind of creates a dip in your lip, it is not done. And so you want to place that carefully back into its spot and back off a little bit. If, however, the wax seems to resist or move with the stamper, like the bottom starts to lift up or it just completely detaches from the stamper, then it's done and you're ready to go. And there you have it, a perfectly round, beautiful wax seal. Perfect for your minimal or modern wedding aesthetic, or just some fun snail mail. If you found this video helpful, I would really appreciate it if you would give me a thumbs up. I so appreciate it when you guys give me feedback or you will share this video with those that you think would enjoy it. If you're interested in more wax seal videos or have any specific questions, please leave those in the comment section down below, and I will see you next time. Happy stamping!